Today I continue my search for the perfect vintage 50mm f2 lens with this one, the Nikon 50mm f2. Can it beat the very intense competition in this sector? To find out, keep watching. Well, hey everybody, welcome to another one and thank you for checking in once again. So the 50mm f2 sector is a very crowded one in the vintage lens market. Everybody made a 50mm f2 or a 50mm f1.8 and most of them are very competent lenses. Like this little Miranda, for example. This lens was very cheap back in the day. They're still very cheap now. It's the cheapest of the cheap, and even this lens makes a very nice image. I was very impressed by what this little lens can do, and it's the same for almost all of them. It's the same for this Chinon 50 f1.9. It's the same for the Helios 58 f2. It's the same for the Olympus Zuiko, and it's the same for the little wonderful and delightful Jupiter 8 here. So to do well in this sector, this Nikon 50 f2 needs to be better than very competent. It needs to be outstanding. Nikon gear usually carries a price premium, and this lens was and is no exception. I recently bought this lens on eBay. In fact, just last week I bought this lens on eBay and I paid £70 for it. Most of these other lenses, including ones from the major manufacturers, you can get for around £40 to £50. Those are auction prices. And the cheaper lenses like the Miranda or the Chinon you can get for much cheaper, around about £20 if you're lucky. So this lens has quite a bit to prove. It's got to prove its price premium. So to do well in this sector, it's got to be better than merely very competent. To do well in this sector, it's got to be outstanding, and it's got to be this lens. This is the Carl Zeiss Jena Pancolar. It's still my gold standard for 50mm f2 or f1.8 lenses. If you've seen this channel before, you may have heard me say that before. I've said it a number of times and it remains true no matter how many of these lenses I've tested. This one, the CZJ Pancolar 51.8, stands right at the top of the tree, and that by some significant margin. So can the Nikon beat it? Well, to find out, keep watching. There it is sitting on my Sony A7 where it looks pretty good. As usual, we need an adapter which does add an inch or so of length, but having said that, this is a nice light lens. It's not too big and it's very easy to carry around all day. This is an extremely well made lens in the Nikon tradition. Most Nikon gear is very well made. Let's have some focus, please. Thank you. And this little optic is absolutely no exception. There you can see the coatings. It's got bluey greeny type coatings which does influence the colour of the lens. Mechanically it's constructed extremely well. This one's in very nice condition, I have to say. It was made between 1974 and 79 if I'm right. Do correct me if you know better. This has the traditional Nikon look. I do like these multicoloured markings that they put on their lenses, or they used to put on their lenses. It's still got its nice polished black barrel, and the focus ring still turns nicely, very smooth and clean. And the same for the aperture ring. This aperture ring has focus, thank you. This aperture ring has no half stops, it has single stops only, and it goes from f2 to f16. So a very nicely made lens, a very compact lens. I have to say it's not as nicely made as the Pentax 55mm f2 or f1.8. They're the same lens. If you happen to have a copy of that lens, you will know that Pentax lenses are possibly the finest made vintage lenses of all. That is, in their construction techniques, they are superb. This one is a close second, but it's not quite, in my view, made quite as nicely, but it is a lovely piece of old mechanical slash optical engineering. A very nice lens, nicely constructed, nice and light and nice and small. Alright, let's check out how this lens shoots, and we'll look at colours first. In the past, using my 50mm f1.4 Nikon lens, I've been very impressed by its distinctive colour palette, and that is a colour palette that other Nikon lenses I've used have shared to a certain degree, to a greater or lesser degree. The 51.4 shows it most, and I really like that colour palette, so I was hoping this one would give me something similar. Well, the colours from this one are not quite the same as that 51.4. The 51.4 gave very extraordinary shades of green and red, just a unique colour palette. This colour palette too is unique, but it's unique in a slightly different way. It does have something of that, what I call the Nikon colour palette feel from time to time in certain shots and in certain lighting conditions, but it does have a colour palette all its own. It's fresh, it's cool, it's not a warm colour palette, it's slightly on the cool side, which I really like. I think that makes for a very clean, very fresh, very invigorating sort of image, and this one has it. This shoots cool, and it has a very sort of, how can I put it, a sort of a texture that it applies to images, a creamy, smooth, velvety sort of texture that it applies to images. And it struck me that, or it reminded me somewhat, it put me in mind of images from Polaroid cameras, the very creamy, glassy, smooth sort of feel that those images, that Polaroid images have. This lens too has to a certain degree. This is a very sharp lens indeed, and although sharpness isn't everything, it is something, and you don't want a muddy, smeary, blurry sort of shot wide open that is difficult to really use. This lens delivers in the sharpness department. It's one of the sharpest 50 f2s that I've shot, and it stands comparison with the best of them. It's sharper than the Pentacon 50mm f1.8. It's a little sharper than the Helios 58 f2. It's probably a bit sharper than the Pentax 55 f1.8/f2 as well. I think it's as sharp as the Pancolar, and it is a little sharper than the Jupiter. So a very sharp lens indeed. It's well known for it, actually. All the online reviews say how extraordinarily sharp this lens is, and having used it, I can only agree. Wide open, it is as sharp as the best of them, and stopped down, it gets bitingly sharp. Now, being an f2 lens, this optic will make you plenty of background blur, and the closer you stay to your subject, the better. This lens focuses to 45 centimeters, which is about average for this class of lens. The only one I know that goes closer is the Carl Zeiss Pancolar, which goes down to, I think, where have I put it now? Somewhere. I think it's 35 centimeters. Yeah, 35 centimeters. So that one goes really close. But this one goes to 45, so that's nice and close, and you'll get plenty of blur if you stay near that minimum focus distance. Wide open will give you the maximum blur that your lens can make, and if you stay wide open, you get some blur persisting with subjects up to around 6 to 8 feet away, something like that. The quality of the blur is not the finest. It can be a little bit rough and a little bit harsh, especially if there are any straight lines or branches of trees, foliage in the background. So it's not the softest blur by any means. The Jupiter 8 has nicer blur than this Nikon does, certainly according to my eye. It's about the same probably as the Olympus Zuiko. This lens, the Zuiko, does have slightly rough blur, slightly rougher than I would like. And the Nikon is about similar to it. The Helios gives nicer, softer blur. This Chinon 1.9 gives nicer, softer blur. The Pancolar is slightly nicer as well, though not very much, because that also does give slightly harsh blur at times, but it's nicer than this one. I think this one is probably a bit more harsh on more occasions. It can be very nice. It can be lovely and soft if you get your distances right, your camera subject background distances right. But there are quite a few occasions in that distance, in those ranges of distance, where blur from this one does turn a bit harsh, a little bit nervous, a little bit, nervous. That's the sound nervous blur makes. So it's not the best. If you like soft blur, it's not the best, but it does have plenty of character. It will give your images loads and loads of character, and you can play with it as well. Harsh blur is not always unpleasant. However, in summary, blur from this Nikon lens is not the softest of this group. This Nikon lens does show some chromatic aberration, which is purple and green fringing on edges, and you see that most often and most prominently in a shot of, for example, bare tree branches against a bright sky. You'll see a little bit of separation at the edges of those branches, at the boundaries of those branches, and this lens does show some of it. It's not awful, don't let me give you the wrong impression, but it's not as good as most of these other lenses, I think, that are here today. The 51.4 Nikon lens does give a great deal of chromatic aberration wide open. This one is nothing like as bad, but it does appear sometimes. You can see it sometimes, and you can see it more often than you can with, for example, this Olympus Zuiko lens. This is really not as bad as the Nikon for chromatic aberration. In fact, neither are lenses like this Helios or even the humble Jupiter 8. This Nikon does show quite a bit of chromatic aberration. It shows a little more even than this Miranda lens, and I was a little surprised by that, but not too surprised, because the 51.4 had shown it, and I did kind of expect some in the 50 f2. The lens that does better than this, or significantly better than this, is the Pancolar, the Carl Zeiss Sienna Pancolar. That's the lens that gives the least chromatic aberration of any 50 f1.8/f2 that I've tried, and that's wide open. I'm not talking about shooting stock down where these problems, optical problems, tend to become less, but shooting wide open, the CZJ Pancolar has hardly any chromatic aberration. The Nikon does have quite a bit. So what do I think of this lens? Well, I'll be honest, I really love it. It makes fantastic images that have a character, images that are unique, images that couldn't be made by any other lens. You may well recognize images from this lens, and you may well be able to pick them out from the crowd. It does have a distinctive character. It makes lovely, beautiful images. I love the colour. It's very sharp. Background blur's a bit rough, and it does have a bit of CA, so it's not the most technically accomplished lens here. Even some of the much older lenses beat it technically in one or two departments, but it has the magic. The elements come together to make something beautiful. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts in the case of this lens, and I'm really pleased to see that, because I really wanted this to be a nice lens, and it really is a lovely lens. And I'd pick this lens in preference to quite a few of these other 50 f2s. Would I pick it in preference to the Pancolar? No, I don't think I would. I don't think I would. It does have a magic, but it doesn't quite have the magic of the Pancolar, and it's very, very difficult to explain just exactly what that magic is. It's another case of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. Again, in the case of the Pancolar, the blur isn't terribly good. It's not particularly soft or particularly nice, but everything comes together in that lens to create something extraordinary. This is an extraordinary lens too, but I don't think it's quite as extraordinary as the Pancolar. Is it worth the premium over other 50mm f2 lenses? Yeah, I think it probably is. I think it probably is worth 30 quid more. It's worth paying that to get the qualities that this lens can put into an image. The Zuiko 50mm f1.8 is a really, really nice lens, but it doesn't quite have the character of this one, and I might well pick the Nikon over the Olympus. A very, very, very nice lens indeed. One that I recommend you try. Remember that if you don't like a vintage lens that you buy, they're not going down in price, so assuming you haven't paid too much to begin with, you'll be able to sell it on for a good price and not lose anything, and you might even make a profit into the bargain. So I would advise everyone to try one of these 50 f2s, and once you've tried it, you might well find that this is your main 50 f2. It's such a nice lens. The Pancolar is just that bit nicer, but this is a very, very, very close second. So there we are. That's the Nikon Nikkor 50mm f2. Well, I guess that's probably about it from me for today. So many, many thanks for watching. I'm very pleased that you've tuned in. If you've enjoyed this episode, you might want to chuck us a sub. That would be very much appreciated too. Many, many thanks go to subscribers. Thank you for your support. That is a genuine thank you to you, and many, many thanks also go to subscribers. If it wasn't for the support of subscribers, we wouldn't be able to make this show in the way we do. So many, many thanks to you. That is a heartfelt thanks to you. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in, watched, given thanks, super thanks, left comments, chucked us a sub, engaged with the channel in any way whatsoever. And if you're not doing anything too difficult, irritating or troublesome next week at around this time, please do tune in for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.